My name is Eugenie Birch, and I am the Nussdorf Professor of Urban Research at the University of Pennsylvania. Today I'm going to talk to you about slums and cities, the past, the present, and the future. So the first thing we want to talk about is what is a slum? A slum is a heavily populated place. It is a place that is lacking in public services, it is lacking in adequate housing, and security of tenure is not often there. There are three things I want to tell you about slums today. First of all, slums have been with us forever. In our society, however, we think about them in the late 19th century through the 21st century as being a more challenging problem than ever before. Secondly, there have been very interesting common patterns in how people have diagnosed slums, charted slums, and provided solutions for slums, and we're going to look at that over time. And lastly, I want to conclude with the fact that slums are part of a whole city. And when we're thinking about slum processes and slum policies for improvement, we also need to think about improving whole cities and the regions in which they exist. So let's go. Here's a slide that shows you a roadmap for what we're going to be talking about today. It's looking at slums in Western Europe, North America, South America, Asia, and Africa. And it's talking about where they're located, the types of organization they have, and the types of solutions that over time have been given. And lastly, there's a little box on the bottom that talks about everyone who's written about slums or portrayed slums in some way, whether it be in cinema or photography. This chart will be linked to this lecture so that you can study it at your leisure. So let's go to the first place. Let's look at Western Europe. We have a very long quote on the top of this slide, and basically it is a description by Frederick Engels, who was sent at age 20, in his 20s, to go to England to look at the textile industry, to find out about the industry by his parents who owned such factories. He got there and saw things that he thought were just execrable and began to write about them, and we all know what happened. But when you read this description, you will see that this description could be a description that we would give today to various places in the world that have slums. So let's look at how people documented besides in the written word. There were mappers. Of great importance was Charles Boothe, who surveyed London, making maps such as you see here, and taking notes about where and what was happening in various slums. This particular one is Bethnal Green, which was the worst slum probably in the world at the time, and would become the subject of clearance and renewal as a result of the work that the documenters did, in particular Charles Boothe. And here you can see two graphics. One on the left shows you what the place looked like before the project, and the one on the right shows you the changes that were made. What were the changes that were made? The streets were cleared, the area was reorganized, there was a public space that was in the center. Actually, it was a mound that was made of the demolition materials from the housing itself that was taken down, and people were moved out. They were moved out, and unfortunately they were displaced. Only 11 of the original residents came back into this site. But this was the idea. Here is a building in that Bethnal Green Boundary Estate project. The idea of what needed to be done to improve housing. There needed to be ample light, there needed to be ample air, there needed to be green space. It's not green there, but you can imagine the leaves in the springtime, and the streets needed to be wide so that the various vehicles could get through. This becomes an enduring theme that you will see. Later on, the British take up this kind of housing. It was called council housing, such that by the end of World War II, or in the post-World War II period, they built so much housing because 4 million units were destroyed in that time. They built so much housing that 50% of the British population lived in council housing. It was a major effort to make sure that the population lived in standard housing with minimum activities. At the same time that people were building housing and clearing slums, there were other folks who were thinking about how cities should be arranged and how we could decant some of the slums. What you're seeing here is a slum on the left of Barcelona. What you're seeing in the middle is a map, and on that map, dark purple represents the old city, and the lighter purple represents an urban extension that was designed to accommodate the growth that the people of Barcelona knew was occurring and were experiencing at the time. Interestingly enough, this plan does get executed, but it did not get executed without a lot of complaints. The real estate developers hated it, the social workers hated it, everybody hated it. But somehow politics prevailed, good sense prevailed, and good planning prevailed, and the city was able to grow from 178,000 to the multi-millions it is today and to accommodate people there. The British also thought about these sorts of things as well in their Garden City principles. The idea here was we wouldn't keep people in the cities, but we would move them to satellite cities at the periphery of a main city. The idea was put forth in the 1890s. It gets executed after World War II, when 22 so-called new towns will be built to accommodate growing populations in England itself. So this idea of changing the urban arena is very, very present in European thinking. Let's now move to North America and see what was happening there. You're looking here at FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is giving his second inaugural address. At this time, he is saying that famous line, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed." This is many decades after much reform had happened in the world of housing, but still 1/3 of the nation was ill-housed. How did we know? We knew because of the documentation that was going on. Now, this is some of the housing that you would have seen in some of the larger cities. We're looking at New York City. You're looking at the type of tenements that were built at the late 1890s through the early 1920s, where you might have 6, 7, 8 people in a room. You wouldn't have water, you wouldn't have a toilet, very little open space, and so forth. The famous documenter of this was Jacob Riis, who, with the discovery of the flash, went right into the homes and showed what life was like, not only the residential life, but the work life. If you look at the lower corner, you can see the family, children, mom and dad, all working to produce some goods to sell. That child didn't go to school. At the same time, you had people who were beginning to think more scientifically about how to document these kinds of things, and we're looking here at Pittsburgh at something called the Pittsburgh Survey, which was the first social science survey that was done of slum conditions, much like Charles Boothe did in London, but in this case, the mappers are associating density and congestion and poor housing on the left with typhoid illness on the right, and showing this relationship between poor housing conditions and illness. Now back to New York. What you're looking at on the left are floor plans of 3 different kinds of housing. The first on the far left is what the housing was before any laws were passed to protect and make the housing better. You have a rear house and a front house. You don't have any windows, you don't have any toilets, you don't have any water. In the middle image, you see the rear house is gotten rid of, but the tenement itself is expanded into the lot and covers much more of the lot. No inside windows, as you can see. And on the far right, you see something that was an innovation, model housing. It was called the dumbbell tenement, and what that meant was there would be an air shaft in the center of the building, and windows would be attached to that. And you can see what the profile of the buildings looked like in the pictures on the right. The solution to these kinds of things were 3. First, better laws. Second, creating model tenements that philanthropic groups might build. And thirdly, public housing that by 1937 the United States would get engaged in and would be building housing much like the international style housing that Le Corbusier was suggesting for the rest of the world. The way it was organized was that local authorities built that housing. It came under good bit of criticism over time, even though it did offer the light and air that is so required, as you can see from the building in the upper right-hand corner. What we began to see was what we call the concentration of poverty in places, because these were large-scale developments, and the lack of mixed income. By the 2000s, the United States Housing Authority would decide that they would sponsor something called Hope 6, which would try to change some of these conditions, varying the types of housing, bringing in middle-income folks, and therefore reducing the amount of concentrated poverty. Well, this is the brief history of what was happening in the developed world in housing. Let's take a look at slums in the 21st century, and we'll change our locale, of course, because the focus now is going to be in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. We know of course, through the movies, through the press, that there are many, many significant places that are known by name in terms of their slums. There's Kibera in Nairobi. There's Dharavi in Mumbai. Huge areas of Mexico City. This graphic is just showing you the location of some of those well-known slums. But don't let this fool you, because the plan before showed you the level of slum development in those countries, and in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it's 60–70% of the population lives in slums. And what do these slums look like? It depends upon what era in which they were built. If you're looking at Latin America, as we are here, you can see that the buildings are made of brick and are much more solid, but they have this congested situation that we talked about, and you can rest assured there's very few public services here. There's a little bit of greenery. If you go to Asia, you will see that the materials are much more flimsy. They're built later on, and therefore the families haven't had time to improve them. And the same thing in Africa. Over time, the individual slum dwellers will improve their housing as they capture funding to do so, buying it brick by brick. But there are problems with the slums that we know today. First of all, forced eviction. Second of all, no security of tenure. Third of all, resettlement and replacement. And the lack of public goods, public services is as shocking today as it was in the late 19th century in the United States and Europe. It simply don't exist. So let's take a look at a couple of cases where improvements have occurred. We'll look at what I'm going to call top-down improvements. That is, not top-down because they're only governmental, but top-down because they're started by the government, and bottoms-up because I'm calling them those because they're people-instituted activities. So we'll first go to Medellin, which is the site of the World Urban Forum, and you can see from this map articulated the slums in Medellin in the purple, and in the orange you can see areas that the city decided to deal with. Now the first thing they did was to announce a slum upgrading policy, but before they detailed it completely, they engaged the citizens of the places in understanding and helping design what these would be. One of the problems of the Medellin settlements were, of course, their location on hills. As you can see in those brick constructions in the back there, they're quite isolated from the other parts of the city. Solve that problem? Cable cars. You can move people quickly, inexpensively into the rest of the city. Also, you couldn't get from one part to another. So what did we do? What did they do? They started electric stairs or escalators to move people from one part of the slum to the other. And lastly, remember those cables? Well, the cable cars, they landed in certain places, and where they landed, public space was put aside for a library, for a health clinic, or whatever, so that there would be a communal space for the residents of that particular place. So let's move to the bottoms-up type of slum upgrading. Remember, in the 19th and 20th century, we talked about documentation of the slum. Well, the same thing is happening here in the 21st century, except that it's different. This time, it's not the expert who's documenting the slum, but it's the people who live in the slum itself. Who better knows who and what is happening in the slums than those who live there? Excellent for figuring out what's happening. Why do they want to figure out what's happening? Because they're going to take those maps, translated to GIS maps through technical assistance that's paid for by such foundations as the Gates Foundation, Rockefeller, and Ford. They're going to take those maps to the local authorities and say, hey, we're here. You didn't think we were here, but we are, and here's the evidence, because we've counted ourselves, and you need to pay attention. We need water, we need services, we need schools, we need waste disposal. We're here, please take care of us. This knowledge has been greatly aided by the work of the Global Land Tool Network that UN Habitat has started about 5 years ago. Through a series of technical publications which are shared throughout the world, the various groups can be trained to undertake the kind of enumeration and the kinds of reforms that need to go forward in order to not only count who's there, map who's there, but also begin to talk about different kinds of security of tenure, which is also a critical need to be defined in the 21st century. As in the 19th century, model housing is also being built in the 21st century slum. It's a little different now. It's not multifamily, it's single family. Materials are more delicate, one might say, but the climate is different. But what's there is the appropriate things to make a neighborhood a real neighborhood that can be knit back into the city. Wide streets, water, power, basic amount of space for the individuals who live in these units. They may look simple to you, but they certainly are a far cry from what you saw earlier of the current conditions in which people are living. As we think about these kinds of devices, the way that slums have been accommodated over the centuries, and the continuing patterns that we see in documentation, amelioration, we also need to think about, as we talked about earlier, how cities are integrating or thinking about the slum dwellers as part of the whole city. We are hopeful in the near future that the Sustainable Development Goals will incorporate an urban goal and set of targets. Among the things that we're talking about are these 11 steps. Hard to read here on the screen. I'll brief you on them now. They'll be linked to this film. But if we could follow these 11 steps, we have a way to have a slumless world. What do we need first? We need a national urban policy. We need to stop sprawl. We need to have the number of people who are living in slums and increase the number of people who have affordable housing. We need to deal with mobility. We need to deal with energy. We need to deal with water, sanitation, and waste. We need to deal with open space. We need to deal with crime. We need to deal with health. And lastly, resilience. If we deal with these things, if we meet these targets, I can promise you that we'll live in a much better world.